Thank you, Helen, for the introduction. And I believe I have like an hour from now on, something like that. That room is muted already, I think.
I'm sorry.
All
Yes.
right.
Go ahead.
All right. I'll go ahead. So I have this intriguing, maybe a little bit too strong of a title, but I like to keep it that way. So I'm going to take you to the world of sparse computations. So first, I'm going to describe what our research group does in a slide. Helen was a member, as she said, until very recently. We work on sparse data structures like sparse matrices, tensors, and other kind of sparse data structures that I haven't listed here. We develop new data structures, algorithms. We identify new computational primitives. We have been an active contributor to the Graph Plus standard that essentially does graph computations in the language of sparse matrices. We do develop communication avoiding algorithms for such problems, data structures design, parallel computing, and we have lots of applications that I'm going to walk you through in graph learning, in protein analysis, in graphs, and genomics. And you can find the link to our research group at passion.lbl. So what does the title has to do with it? In some reality, it is true to begin with. We do live in a sparse universe. So what we see here is actually a two-dimensional projection of the sky, right? What we see in the sky is just a 2D projection of a 3D space. And even then, it's not completely dense, meaning it has a lot of black sections that do not correspond to any stars or any galaxies. And now imagine this thing in the original three-dimensional way. It has a lot of space that is not occupied with anything. So it is already a sparse universe that we live in. It's not just the things that are out there that are sparse. The man-made structures are generally sparse as well. So this is the so-called the Internet Telescope. It's at UC San Diego. CAIDA maintains data for the internet. And then if you plot the topology of real-time internet measurements, it does have this sparse structure that very few pairwise data is connected with each other. So those are the realities. But what does sparsity bias, right? What does it enable? In reality, it enables, first of all, scalability. Scalability of models is first thing I like to come up with, right? If you try to model a biological system, not every cell will meaningfully interact with each other. If you look at the very successful new paradigms in computing, like compressed sensing and signal processing, sparsity is an assumption, is a precondition. Traffic models, molecules, power grids is all sparse by construction. And if you are in the language of machine learning, convolutional neural networks, graph neural networks have this inductive bias, which is essentially sparsity. That says that I can only interact with my neighbors, right? And the second one is the solutions of, we really cannot solve any system where the interactions are a higher polynomial, like n squared, n cubed, for a large n, if this system was assumed to be dense, right? So you have to make some sparsity assumptions. And many of the famous algorithms that are really widely used are based on these sparsity assumptions. Some of the examples I have is fast multiple method. And if you ever try to solve a constraint optimization system, numerical optimization methods aggressively use sparse computations underneath the covers. And then the curse of dimensionality means that as you go higher and higher dimensions, there'll be fewer and fewer non-trivial interactions left. So sparsity that's always been there for matrices, and people have been taking advantage of it for a long time. That gets more and more important when you go into tensors, which are higher dimensional analogs of matrices, 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional, and so on. So I want to base my slides around this interesting primitive that I have studied for 2 decades. It's the multiplication of 2 sparse matrices. But now that's not exactly true. Because if you look at the primitive, people will call sparse matrix multiplication pretty much anything they get their hands on where one of the operands is sparse. So that's fair, and that leaves us with a lot of different operations, which can be all represented with this funny algebra. There's an A matrix input, there's a B matrix input, there's something called a mask, which tells you what parts of the output that are allowed to be computed and what parts of the output can be ignored. And I kind of try to illustrate an example where in this example, the M has a particular structure. So anything outside that structure, we don't care about, let's say. And so you will see that C has a substructure, as a substructure of M. And these blue dots, if you ever played with Python or MATLAB, this is the plot of the non-zeros. Blue dots are the non-zeros, white space is completely zero and can be ignored for all practical purposes. So what is then sparse matrix multiplication? It can be a SPGEM, which is A and B and sparse. Can be a masked version of SPGEM, not only A and B and sparse, and there's a mask that's sparse. It can be SPMM, where A is sparse and everything else is dense. It can be sample dense matrix multiply, STDMM, where almost everything is dense except the M mask matrix, called the sampling matrix, is sparse. And then there is degenerate cases of these, where the second matrix has only one column. So you come up with the sparse matrix vector multiply and sparse matrix sparse vector multiply. So let's actually start with these patterns to anchor our discussion. Because one reality in computing is that we cannot really solve every important computational problem optimally. There's so many of them out there. So your computing then ends up being about abstractions. What can we abstract from the sets of problems so that one solution will solve more than one application? Ideally, can we just decompose this problem space into maybe 5, 10 different computational paradigms that once we study them well and compose them well, we'll solve everything in that application space. In reality, we'll never get 100% of coverage, but if we get like 80, 90%, then the rest can be put together with glue code. So the first pattern is sparse matrix sparse vector multiply. And I'm going to describe this with graphs. And I'm also using graphs because I know in this course you have seen graphs before, and you have studied them, so you must be familiar with it. So here I'm trying to take one step of a breadth-first search on a graph. This famous, if you ever followed, there's a book called The Graph Algorithms in the Language of Linear Algebra. This 7-vertex graph is in the cover. That made it so-called famous among a small group of researchers. How do I traverse on this graph is, let's say I am currently starting from 1, I have already discovered 2 and 4, and I want to find the next frontier, the 2-hop neighbors of 1. And what do? I multiply my sparse adjacency matrix with a vector that has 2 and 4 in it, and it's going to discover 7, 5, and 3. It's going to do a lot of interesting things. It's going to discover first, it's going to reach 7 from 2 and 4. So I need to figure out what to do with that. And I can kind of determine that by passing what's known as a semi-ring, which I'm not going to bore you with. It's just telling the system what to do whenever there is an addition that needs to be done. And for breadth-first search, it doesn't matter. It's always correct. But you can pass the minimum operand if you want some deterministic output, or the maximum, and so on. And the second thing that is happening is it's rediscovering or attempting to rediscover the first vertex, because there's a back edge from 4. And this mask concept, P, that I'm passing here, which is the things that have been discovered before, is gonna avoid me from rediscovering 1. So it kind of keeps track of all the visited vertices. So what you see here is like a linear algebraic primitive will actually do a work-efficient breadth-first search if you keep doing this thing. You do a masked sparse matrix sparse vector product and move the right-hand side to the left, do it again until no more vertices are to be discovered. And you'll get the breadth-first search tree. And you can use this primitive for solving a lot more problems in graphs. So that's the warm-up primitive. I'm not going to actually talk at all about it. But the natural extension of this is, what if I wanted to do a breadth-first search for multiple social vertices? Then I would, instead of having a vector on the right, I would have a matrix, and each column of that matrix would represent one frontier. So this is just showing the initial iteration, where I'm trying to do breadth-first search from 4, 3, and 1, and I'm just simultaneously discovering second hop neighbors or first hop neighbors all at once with one operation. Nothing really changed. The name of GRBMXV, which is the signature on GraphPlus, became GRBMXM. V became M, and that's all. And I'm going to show a couple more examples. So this multi-source breadth-first search by in itself is useful, but you can also use this thing for computing things like centrality scores, or triangle counting, or Markov clustering, which I'm going to talk a few of those. You might have seen people like to count substructures in a graph. They count rectangles, they count triangles, they count k-trusses, and so on. The simplest one you can think is triangles. How can I count a triangle? The simplest way I can come up with is actually I can square the input matrix A, and I will get A square. Except I don't keep any orientation. So that's already a sparse matrix, sparse vector product, right? I do A square, and then what did I find? I'll find all the open triangles. They're also called wedges, right? The wedges like this. And then I can just compute a Hadamard product, which is a pairwise, element-wise product with the original A, and then figure out if it's closing a triangle or not. Except now I'm counting by a factor of 6, because a wedge can be counted this way, that way, and so on. So one way to optimize this thing is to split the original matrix into L and U pieces. I will give you all the edges that go from a high numbered vertex to a low numbered vertex, and U will give you a low number to a high numbered vertex. If you do it this way, you're only counting wedges where the middle one is the smallest among the vertex numbers. This will still double count, so you have to divide by 2. And there's a faster algorithm that can do this thing without any double counting. It's just multiplying L with L transpose. No, L with L would be enough. But I somehow like this figure. I keep it. So you can do matrix, sparse matrix products for triangle counting. With masks, it's going to do just as fast as any other algorithm. And it will depend on who is implementing the sparse matrix sparse vector product with the mask. And they can optimize based on whether the mask is too sparse or the input is too sparse. So they can just reorganize the computation accordingly. Now I'm going to go into my first application that uses sparse data structures. So this is a problem called protein family identification. It's defined as given a large collection of proteins, which are building blocks of life. Identify groups of them that are homologous. So homology is a concept you might have heard in biology. It just technically means to be descending from a common ancestor. But for practical purposes, homologous proteins often have the same function. I have a hemoglobin protein, and it turns out even soybean is an homolog that carries oxygen to the cells. It doesn't look very much like my version of that protein, but it has the same function. So what do I want to find? I want to find these groups. What am I going to gain if I find these groups? Well, if I sequence new proteins, and it happens a lot in this study called metagenomics, where you're studying organisms in the wild. You are sampling from a lake or from a soil sample, and you try to find organisms that are not sequenced before, and you want to figure out what they do so that you can use them to maybe come up with new proteins, enzymes that can break down plant mass faster. And that can be used for biofuel production, more efficient biofuel production. Or you can find things that somehow capture carbon in the soil those kind of enzymes exist. If you can capture more carbon in the soil, then you're actually solving a lot of the world's climate problems, right? A lot of our carbon is captured in the soil. That's what coal is essentially. So can we actually engineer it to be, and it's all about finding new proteins and enzymes to do that. So that's the goal, but it's a very computationally expensive process. You start with protein sequences, which are abundant, easy to get, because you just sequence the DNA and you translate them. And from then on, you build a graph, protein similarity graph. Call it network, you can call it graph. And that's done by a process called protein similarity search. And I'm going to describe one tool that we developed for this, but there's plenty of tools out there that does that. Essentially, it is trying to generate a similarity graph without doing all pairs of comparisons between proteins, because you'll have a billion proteins. A billion square is a lot of numbers, and each comparison is already quadratic in the length of the protein, so you're out of luck if you compare every pair. You have to do something that eliminates a lot of the pairs from consideration without even running an algorithm between them. And then once you build the graph, you can run a graph clustering algorithm, and often for this problem, an algorithm called Markov cluster algorithm that does simulate a random walk, or a flow-based algorithm, some people say that, will discover you the clusters, which then you interpret to be protein families after some filtering. So here's the end study. We have worked on this problem by providing the computational tools and running a lot of these ourselves. And in this study, this is a large study of gathering the world's metagenome data sets from all available resources, databases out there. That includes archaea, bacteria, vira, eukarya. These are the kingdoms of life. And then, converting those transcriptomes to proteins, trying to eliminate all the proteins that already are known by some measure of similarity, and putting really stringent cutoffs so that we get a graph that's sufficiently sparse. If we had more computational power, we would put much more relaxed cutoffs, and we would potentially discover more interesting things. But even for the supercomputing scale tools we've developed, there is a limit on how much we can actually efficiently cluster. And then the results I'm going to get to, this was published about 5 months ago in Nature, discovers a lot more structures than that were known. But one of the first results is a lot of novel protein families that you can map into ecosystems, like soil, plants, marine, mammals, and so on. And then what else happens? I don't know if this one tells you, oh, there's a missing slide here. This actually effectively doubled the number of known protein families on Earth. So, and I don't know why that super important detail is missing on this slide. State that. So before this study, and after this study, the number of known protein families on Earth basically increased by a factor of 2. And after that, we actually ran those protein families to this maybe well-known software called AlphaFold, which predicts structure for proteins. And we did pretty much the same kind of filtering there to the known structural databases now, and discovered novel folds, the different ways a protein will fold than previously were known. And these are really with high confidence. So that was really cool. So I'm going to go back and then try to give you what is happening computationally inside these things. This is like the pitch of what we discovered. But so I'm going to first start by DNA. The protein will follow naturally. If I wanted to find pairs of DNA fragments, and this is often used within a process called genome assembly. You don't need to know if you haven't heard about it. But think of this as you have DNA fragments and you're trying to find which ones can potentially overlap. And you don't want to do n-square comparisons because each comparison is very expensive, which is quadratic in the length of the DNA sequence in the first place. and there's many of them. What you can do is use the subsequences as a filter. These are called k-mers. It comes from Greek. So I think it's like merus or something, a length of k subsequences. And you use this as a database index. So you cut your DNA into k-mers, and then you can then use that k-mers as a hash table. Or in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to create a sparse matrix with the rows being the reads, meaning the DNA fragments. That's the technical name, read. And the columns will be k-mers. So if I multiply this sparse matrix with this transpose, what I'm asking the system to find is find me all pairs of reads that share at least one k-mer. And you can filter those k-mers or select them any way you like, and there's a cottage industry for that. But assuming you did a good job, then you will find for every non-zero in the output read by read matrix, it's what we call an overlap matrix. These are precisely the reads that share at least one k-mer. And you can statistically bound a lot of things. Say that if they don't share a k-mer for k equals 7, or k equals 13, k equals 17, it really depends on what you're dealing with. Their chances of overlapping with this error rate is negligible. So I'm just going to only look at these remaining pairs for my expansive comparisons. And this multiplication operation is actually more than just like addition and multiplication. It does other things like tracking the position of the k-mer that is shared between reads. Again, I'm brushing this off. This is the semi-ring based computation that DraftPlaza or many other software that I've built or developed support. It's not that rocket science. It's really about overloading the addition and multiplication operators. And even NVIDIA's high-performance libraries like QSparse support that today. So how do I go from reads, DNAs to proteins? The reality is really different in protein space. And because when I'm trying to find overlapping DNA fragments, I'm trying to find exact matches. When I'm trying to find related proteins, I am trying to undo millions of years of evolution that has already happened. So the hemoglobin protein that I have, or you guys have, everybody has, is quite different than the one in the plant. And a lot of evolution has gone through that, and some letters have changed. So the signal I'm trying to detect is much weaker than an exact overlap. I'm just sometimes only trying to find 30% average nucleotide identity. So using k-mers as a dictionary doesn't work there, because you might not find any k-mer that is shared between two proteins that are homologous, but they might still be homologous. So what can I do? I can do this concept called substitutes, meaning for each k-mer, I'm going to look at the evolutionary database that I've built that says the letter P in the protein alphabet, if it ever changes to letter I, it has a big penalty of 3. But if it changes to K, it has a penalty of -1 only. So which means, I'm going to penalize these things differently. So for each k-mer, I'm going to find the closest k-mers of the same length that it could have evolved into. And then I'm going to use this and encode them in another sparse matrix. So instead of computing A times A transpose, which is what I used to use for exact k-mer matches, I'm going to build this substitution matrix where the rows are the original k-mers and columns are substitute k-mers. And this way, when I do A times S times A transpose, I'm going from the original protein by k-mers to k-mers by substitute k-mers and back to substitute k-mers to proteins. So I'm finding basically approximate matches, but I'm still using the same machinery, meaning I still don't write any new code to multiply these matrices because I've already written it decades ago. So it's using the fastest communication avoiding sparse matrix multiply. I just need to formulate accordingly. So this was a paper in 2020. It's been a while, but we continued working on this. And this was a so-called Gordon Bell price nominee. So this price is has been funded back in the day. I don't know if still by Gordon Bell, a pioneer in supercomputing, and he was skeptical about large-scale supercomputing being useful for anything back in the 80s. And he said, for anyone that can show me a non-trivial application scaling to large numbers of processors, I'm going to give, I don't remember the dollar amount back in the day he promised. And this award has been getting, of course, harder and harder because people actually solved a lot of sophisticated problems with this. So in this case, we have optimized and played with this pastis code, and we were able to essentially perform this protein similarity construction in almost 500 million proteins in using a giant portion of the Summit supercomputer. And for that, we had to do a lot of load balancing, exploiting symmetry. Of course, we use GPUs and so on. And this is the output generation that writing this thing down was actually one of the most time-consuming parts, like 30 terabytes of data. Most of these supercomputers are really fast and crunching numbers, not all that good at I/O, turns out. And if you compare it with the state-of-the-art, a similar tool that was also supercomputer scaled called Diamond, we're basically fast in however way you slice it, in alignment rate, in per node, in search space size. We eliminate a lot better things, and so on. So, okay, pastis generates protein similarity graphs. What do we do with them? We need to cluster them to get the actual protein families. And for that, we're going to use the macro cluster algorithms. Wildly successful in this field, thousands of citations. The idea is that if you start a random walk from any vertex, very basic idea, the chances are you will be trapped within that cluster, which with much higher probability than not, right? If you have a well-defined cluster. So what do? I try to simulate a random walk from every starting vertex at the same time. And hopefully I will discover some clusters. I need to do some other things to make sure this computation doesn't explode in complexity, because if I'm just pushing probability to my neighbors, I'll just push it everywhere. And then everything will become dense. So the process enforces sparsity at each step so that, again, go back to the beginning of my talk, sparsity is necessary for scalability and to solve large problems. So I need to kind of enforce sparsity by cutting some low percentage, low probability links. So what's going to happen is I'm going to do expansion, which is squaring the sparse matrix. And I'm going to prune small entries and also keep the column sparse. If I see a dense column, which it means like a vertex is connected to many, many, many other vertices, I'm going to put an upper limit on it. How do I implement this thing? I can first do sparse matrix product, then I do some sort of brute force cutoff, pruning, or top K selection. This is also a nice primitive, selecting the top K entries. So I can do that for each column. And then there's another step, inflation, I'm not going to talk about. But it turns out that just squaring a sparse matrix of this scale is not feasible. Because if you have a sparse matrix where the number of non-zeros per row or column is 1,000 and it's randomly distributed, when you multiply it by itself, you'll get a column or row with a million non-zeros. So I can't really store that even like temporarily. So I have to do something a little bit more careful. And I'm going to form a subset of columns at a time, like this example, a square subset of columns. And this batch size B will be chosen based on my memory, how much memory I can afford to store. The bigger the B, the better it is, because I get more parallelism, and I will actually communicate fewer entries of the first matrix. But then I can immediately prune this thing. and then deal with the next batch of columns. So that's what HipMCL does, among other things. And then it uses some state-of-the-art algorithms, no longer state-of-the-art, but when we published this thing 6 years ago, they were. And it clusters inputs that, of course, the shared memory version cannot do on machines that no longer exist today. And some of these things are results at the time. Then we moved HipMCL to accelerators with machines with GPUs, and we did our initial study in Summit at Oak Ridge. You might have played with that machine because you're in Georgia Tech. That's probably proximity-wise the closest thing. And I'm not going to actually talk about the technicals here. The challenge there, though, I want to highlight was keeping the GPUs busy. And it's not surprising, right? Anyone who has worked with GPUs is they can do a lot of number crunching, but this bus, PCIe bus, and between the GPU and CPU, as well as the network interface card that goes out to the rest of the network, are usually choke points, right? So we do some sort of pipelined algorithm where things are trying to be overlapped thanks to pipelining, just like the CPU will do pipelining for individual instructions, so it doesn't have to wait all the time. And if you do all of those things, pipeline sparse summa, lots of sophisticated new algorithms for the GPU, you can actually get a really significant speed up compared to a non-GPU version, like over 12x. So that's what we use with combined with Tastis and HipMCL. We could solve the protein family identification problem in the world's largest possible data sets. Any questions so far? I'm kind of halfway into my lecture on this. So I'm going to move into a completely different area.
1 second, let me, there's a question in the room. Go ahead.
So like the speed up enabled them to do this like protein identification that was never possible before? Couldn't like a previous way longer to do it?
Exactly, because the HipMCL tool, like the predecessor MCL, has no distributed memory support. So you're limited by the biggest machine you can buy with memory. And the kind of calculations we had to do for this thing required us to use half of the whole supercomputer. So there is no such machine that we could have used, even if the person was willing to wait for the next 6 months for the clustering step.
That makes sense.
So.
Other questions? I have one. Can you express direction optimization in the language of linear algebra? Sorry,
Yes.
going away.
Yes.
Okay.
But I have 5 different slides. Well, it's actually super easy because that's actually a very nice set of slides I used to have for this thing, but I stopped giving that six years ago because it was old news. I didn't think that it was possible, right? I didn't think it was possible. And then I had a PhD student with John Owens, and he said like, oh, no, this is really trivial, right? So, and it's really trivial because of masks. So nothing here says that you have to do matrix multiplication in any order. All this is saying is, here's an input matrix, here's an input vector, here's a mask that you should use, and compute me the output of this call, the GRBMXV. And whomever is implementing this function, for this practical purposes, it was Carl Yang, and then later Tim Davis, right, for GraphPlus, can look at A, can look at X, can look at P, which is the mask, and say that P is so much sparser than X that instead of multiplying A and X and masking the output with P, I'm just going to go over the entries of P that are not there. These are precisely the entries that I'm allowed to compute. Nothing else matters because I've already computed the rest. I'm just going to go to the undiscovered entries. In this case, there's only 6 left, right? The next iteration. And the system, instead of doing this column-wise multiplication, it will just look at the 6th row and try to find an intersection of the 6th row with the input vector. That's direction optimization. All you're doing is looking backwards. So you're going from the column direction to the row direction and now you're looking at the allowed entries of the output and trying to find an intersection of that column, of that row, sorry, with the last frontier that you're computing. So then you're just suddenly looking back from 6 to 3 and 7 and 5.
Mhm.
And that's essentially what Tim Davis's code now does. It looks at the sparsity. There's a sparsity cutoff. If the output is really sparse, then it just looks backwards from the rows.
Cool.
All right, where are we? So this one I'm going to talk is tensor work. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it because it's really hard to understand the notation in tensor. So I'm going to give you a high-level idea. Okay. The tensors are generalizations of matrices where you have more than 2 dimensions. And often problems are large enough that you need to do some sort of sampling. Sampling is just like intelligently selecting a subset of the input instead of looking at it all. So here, this is a work that computes some so-called leverage scores. So sampling, people can do uniform sampling. And uniform sampling is just uniformly picking a row, right, with equal probability compared to every other row. But instead, some data points are more valuable than other data points. And essentially, a leverage score is an estimate of it. It says how much of an outlier a single point is compared to the rest of the data. Of course, this is, when I say it verbally, every computer scientist or mathematician will say, okay, what does it mean exactly for data? And there's many, many different interpretations. One way is you can do a singular value decomposition of the data and then look at the squares of the singular values. And those are precisely the leverage scores. But intuitive response is more important. So why do I want to compute these things? Because I'm going to use in my sampling. So I want to keep those data points correctly. And this is used in a famous set of algorithms that called CP decomposition. This is decomposing a sparse tensor into low rank factors. So if this is a sparse tensor, you want to get a bunch of rank 1, so-called. The rank concept in tensors is a bit tricky. Rank 1 sum. It's like a SVD, except in tensors. And then it doesn't have the same guarantees. So don't worry about it. So how do I solve this CP decomposition? Usually, you already have a complicated problem, right? You have one input, A, sparse tensor, and you want to compute its factors, U1, U2, U3, or all the way to UN. Okay, I have one known and many unknowns. That doesn't make a lot of sense for a lot of computational people, except that, of course, what you're going to do is you're going to fix everything else, U1 till UI for some I, and then solve for UI. And then you're going to now fix UI and make UI plus 1 the free variable and solve for that. And you're just going to iterate until convergence. You might have to do it hundreds of times. Fix everything else except one variable, solve for that one variable, change the free variable, and do it again. Nice. Okay, so I have this system, AX minus B. This is a least square system, typical. A is sparse, X is unknown, B is known. Beautiful. And then the problem is A has a structure. A is this product, this big product, and called Cotry-Rao product. It's like a Cotry-Rao product of 2 matrices is a column-wise Kronecker product. So if you have this 2 by 2 things, then you get 4 by 2 output. If I had 3 by 2, I would get 9 by 2. So the number of rows go really high. Okay, so and then the methods that are we developed here is actually really the idea is very simple. There's a lot of math here, but I want to say that I can't really form this Cotry-Rao product because the number of rows of each one of these U is high, so like hundreds. And then if I have, sorry, this is not R, this is IJ. This is in the million. So it's in the million, but I have like many of them. So if I actually ever try to form A, I could potentially try to form a matrix with rows 10 to the 20. I can't even index it, forget about actually solving it. So I need to be able to sample from a sparse product without forming the product. So that was the whole crux of this idea. How can I sample from a Catrura product without forming the product? And then the rest is really math. So this is essentially what I was saying. If my I, the mode length of one of the U factors is 10 to the 7, and if there is only 3 such factors, the matrix will have 10 to the 21 rows. You can't even index it. So then I'm going to try to form the samples from these factors, except that they're not independent. That's the problem. There's a sequence of them. One thing I sample here will determine what I'm going to sample next. And then to solve this problem, Vivek, my PhD student, developed a data structure that has certain bounds that are better than anything else out there, that allows you to sample exactly, there is no approximation, from this Catrura product without ever forming the product. So that's the details of this is for the paper. You can read it in Europe's 2023, and this is better in bounds and everything else. Just to give you a little bit of sense of what these things are, I is big. I is the number of rows in each one of the modes. So it's like that's the 10 million number. Okay, R is small. R is the rank that I'm trying to get. Let's say 100. Capital N is really small. It's like how many dimensions the tensor has? 3. Okay, so that really doesn't matter. And you can see that I am able to actually get a data structure whose runtime is logarithmic on this thing, except for there's one-time construction cost, and it's quadratic in the rank. And if you look at anything else, they're actually much worse bounds. And if you look at the results, this algorithm is STSCP. It will get a much better fit to the data. It's almost as good as exact solving. Exact solve doesn't use any sampling. We are still using randomization, using sampling based on leverage scores, but we compute the leverage scores exactly. Whereas this CP-LS Lev is computing leverage scores approximately and leaving a lot of accuracy on the table, depending on which data set. Some data sets it does okay. Some data sets it actually gets worse and worse as you increase the target rank, meaning you're trying to extract more from the data. And for a given budget of solution time, STSCP for any given budget gets a much better fit than anything else. So that's the little tensor stuff. And so that's all I'm going to say about tensors, which is an area that's also new to me, and it's exciting to me because it's such a big space. But you might have already noticed one thing, which is it doesn't fit in the narrative of computational primitives yet, because we haven't actually discovered all the right computational primitives for the tensor computations. So that's like an open problem. And I'm going to close this tensor parentheses and go back to my main narrative of using computational primitives for solving data analytics problems. And I'm going to talk about graph neural networks. So the tensor work is for you to chew on and think about what can be the computational primitives for it. Graph neural networks is being extremely successful, and I don't have a advertisement slide here today, but if you have had the fortune to follow the literature, the protein folding machinery that we've used, for example, that I mentioned earlier, AlphaFold, AlphaFold 2, they are really graph neural networks. There is a chip design paper that came from Google and it apparently is used in production to design TPUs at Google, to optimize the wires and so on. It's a reinforcement learning around the graph neural network. My colleagues work on particle physics, transportation, power grid problems, materials discovery papers that appeared in Nature use graph neural networks a couple of months ago. Even weather forecasting work that blew all the weather forecasting tools out there was using graph neural networks recently. So what is it? It's really about learning from your neighbors. If you have an inherent structure in the data where there is some connectivity you can describe, so you use two things. One is you learn from your neighbors, and you can ignore the rest of the data. So you use the edges as the only way the information can flow in that graph. And that's often called inductive bias, right? That's your belief that anything that's not connected should not be influencing each other. And then you can classify graphs, which would be used for problems in material discovery. You can classify edges, which would be used in particle physics and transportation. Or you can classify nodes, which was often used, for example, it will be used in proteomics, but it can be used in social networks and so on. How can we train graph neural networks? There's two ways of training a graph neural network. You can work on the full graph and try to learn on the whole thing. Or you can try to do a batch-wise thing, mini batching. So you want to only learn about a subset of the nodes. So I'm going to give only a node classification example for the rest of the talk, but all these ideas are generalizable to edge and graph classification. So there is some caveats here. Unlike learning on ImageNet, the convolutional neural networks where there's this little images, but there's millions of them. And all you have to do is to get a sample of 256. I don't call it sample. Get a batch of 256. Train, update your parameters with stochastic gradient descent or some accelerated version of it like Adam. Move to the next one. I can't really do that efficiently in graphs. Why? These images are independent from the rest of the images. So I can just arbitrarily decide what my batch size is. In graphs, this input size, when I choose, let's say, a subset of the nodes, they are dependent on their neighbors. Okay. And so I'm not really able to completely localize my problem. And then here's a better example. If I only use the black nodes here on the right as my batch to train on, if my network has 3 layers, it will have to get information from red, cyan, and blue vertices because of the expansion. I need to gather information in each layer of the graph neural network from. And that would mean that my computational cost or my memory requirements are not really limited on my little thing that I chose. So it's going to be still proportional to the whole graph in many cases, because this is actually a good graph that you can draw on a paper, planar graph. Real graphs are expanders, and they will touch everybody in 5 hops. So that's really bad. So how can you deal with that? Again, you can't just arbitrarily choose a batch. If you're doing mini batch training, you have to do something called a sampling of a graph, and we're going to get to that. Or you can just don't do mini batch training and do full graph training, and that's another option. Okay, so the chances that I'm not going to teach you all about graph neural networks in one 10-minute portion of a lecture. So I'm going to give you a sense of what a graph convolution is. You might have seen this thing. It's all about looking at your neighbor's feature vectors, combining them, and adding your own feature vector to it in some way for your next layer. And then you do it for many layers. So this way, you will be able to learn from L-hop neighbors if your neural network is L-deep. And then you'll make some errors. You'll make some prediction based on your final features. And it will fit the data, training data, in some way. Whatever mistake you made will be backpropagated. And then those features will be updated so that the next time you'll get a better prediction. And the loss will keep going down, ideally. right? So that's all there is. But in matrix terms, what that means is like gathering features from your neighbors. Like look at the perspective of the vertex 6. Its neighbors have vertex 1, vertex 3, vertex 5. They all have some feature vector, some hidden vectors. How do I gather that? Well, I do a matrix, sparse matrix times tall, skinny, dense matrix multiply, where each row of this dense matrix is the feature vectors. With this multiplication, if you just look at the 6th row of this matrix, you're seeing that it's actually merging these feature vectors. How it merges, whether it uses sum or max or whatever, is again, you can change that by the semi-ring. And some people show that being flexible in that department makes you learn fancier algorithms like shortest paths using graph neural networks. But let's not get into that. Computational building block is sparse matrix times tall, skinny, dense matrix. That's our pattern 3, and we use that a lot. And this is really tall and skinny. It's hard to highlight it here. And this is really the whole procedure in forward propagation in code versus back propagation. But what you see here is, in both cases, the operation here is either A transpose times H, sparse, tall, skinny, dense, or A times G, and these are the derivatives of the H. So this is the same dimension as H. So you're doing sparse times tall, skinny, dense in both directions, and this is the same stuff, I think. You can store this for the next layer. I don't know why it sometimes goes back and forward. So how can I solve this problem efficiently? There's many ways of multiplying the sparse matrix with a sparse matrix, or there's many ways of matrix multiply. You might have seen these things. There's 1D, 2D, 3D algorithms. 1D algorithms move one matrix, but communicate a lot. 2D algorithms move two matrices and communicate far less almost all the time. And 3D algorithms has a trade-off. They communicate less than 2D, but they increase the memory consumption. And the reason they're called 1D, 2D, 3D is really about matrix multiply is a computational cube. There's like n cube things you can do in a dense matrix multiply. And if one of your inputs are sparse, you don't have n cube stuff. So this becomes like a Swiss cheese with holes in them. But it still can be described as a cube. And how you slice that cube? If you slice it in 1D, 2D, or 3D, that's all. That's what we like to call it. And then you can extrapolate between them 1.5D, 2.5D, which is such a big space there. I'm not going to be able to talk and make sense. But if you're interested, I can tell you about those later. They're just like, it was shocking to me when I was reading 3D matrix multiply. I'm like, how can I multiply two-dimensional objects on a three-dimensional process grid? That does not make any sense as a grad student. It does, of course, make a lot of sense when you think about it. The work is three-dimensional, so you can, of course, divide a three-dimensional work to three-dimensional process grid. This totally makes sense. And then we have lots of bounds and quite a lot of scaling results that are old. And there's new work. So this is SPM, sparse matrix, tall, skinny matrix multiply. And with this primitive, there's other things you can do. I just want to throw this one out there, which is randomized computation, sketching a matrix. Often we have a matrix that's too large to work on in reality, and we want to reduce this matrix into a smaller version using a so-called a sketch. And now imagine that a data matrix is some sparsity, and the sketch we want to use is dense. It's a really bad idea to form this dense sketch matrix and multiply it, even though people do it in practice, because it will be more expensive to generate S, and it will be effectively impossible to store it. So what you want to do is you want to generate these numbers on the fly as needed while you're multiplying it. So that was the study we have done. Fast multiplication of random dense matrices with fixed sparse matrices. It doesn't say what we do, but we just like trade off the memory traffic with random number generation. So sometimes we had to regenerate numbers. And what's the optimal way to do it? What's the tiling? What's the lower bound? That's all in that paper. And with that, I'm going to move into the last piece of my puzzle, which is that I didn't talk about, sampling from GNNs. I said that you can train a graph neural network in a mini-batch way, but if you do it naively, you're not going to get any performance benefit. You'll actually get slowed down. You have to sample the graph. And there's different classes of samplers. We call them node-wise sampling, layer-wise sampling, graph-wise sampling. And I'm just going to talk about what that means to sample a graph with one picture. So it just means that instead of considering all the neighbors, let's say my mini batch is this black group of vertices that I called 1. Instead of gathering all the one-hop neighbors that are all labeled with 2, with some method, I'm going to say, I'm only going to gather some of them. And I'm going to put a budget. So the layer-wise sampling is essentially what's shown here. It just looks at the aggregated neighborhood of this level, which is all these 2s, and then builds some probabilities. For example, if a vertex like this one is reachable by 2 different paths, it will have a probability proportional to the sum of those paths, the sum of those edges. Whereas this vertex has only one edge coming to it, so it will have probability proportional to only that edge to be retained. So you're trying to keep this guy with a higher probability than that guy, assuming all the edge weights are the same. And for that, you have to somehow generate the next adjacency, but do not really generate it because that's going to be too expensive, and sample from it. This is reminiscent of what we have done with the tensor work. We want to be able to efficiently sample from there without fully materializing it first, right? So there's some methods that to do that, and we do compute probabilities. We do rejection sampling that is faster than the input size. We don't want to have a sampling procedure that is on the order of the number of entries here. We want a sampling procedure that is proportional to the output side. And that's rejection sampling more or less does that. And we can use this method of computing probabilities and extraction of the graph using sparse matrix multiply, SPGEM, our second pattern. For both node-wise sampling, which you can go back, I don't have time now, or layer-wise sampling. I'm just showing one batch. We actually sample from many batches at once, so it becomes sparse times sparse matrix. Here it's only a vector. I'm just showing a degenerate case. And then basically use this primitive that we know of to do efficient sampling. And when we run this thing, we basically compared with the only scalable sampling tool, Quiver, multi-GPU stuff. So for the same GPU count, speed up of Quiver over the GPU count was either 40 or 3x, depending on the input size. And we did see some scaling, but not quite. And one of the reasons this is not scaling all that well is because we are distributing both the graph and the feature vectors. And then we were inspired by other work that says sometimes you don't need to distribute the graph. Sometimes the graph is small enough to fit on the GPU, but the feature vectors are often large. So can we replicate the graph and only distribute the feature vectors? And this is the other work. This is the layer-wise sampling. So this is what happens when you replicate the graph. You get a much better curve of scaling. So these bars are what we achieved, and these lines are what Quiver was achieving. So if we use the trick that Quiver does, we can also be much better scaling, and often better than Quiver, depending on the data set. And this work will appear in MLSys in a month. With that, I think I have to end, where my conclusions are that sparsity is a common problem in computational science and in machine learning. It's used in a lot of different fields. What we want to do is we provide an integrated treatment of sparsity applied different research areas. We call it applied math, but you can call it computational science. And we say that a lot of applications require large-scale distributed memory parallelism, especially large, important scientific problems. And we use a lot of research from communication avoiding algorithms and data structures for sparse matrices and tensors. With that, I am in the 1 hour and 1 minute mark. I think I'm going to thank to several of the people who contributed different pieces of this work that I presented today. And that's it.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Super cool. Questions from folks online? Could you talk a little bit about for leverage score sampling? Could you talk a little bit about like the maybe more of the technical details about like how you map it to like distributed systems and like how you do the like the scaling and stuff like that?
That's actually a different paper I didn't actually talk about. That's also online. That's an interesting area too, because people have looked at different ways of parallelizing it, that operation. It kind of looks like SPMM actually, the whole thing. And we had a different way of presenting the parallelism, which is we call it tensor stationary. So that's like different than what most people have done. There's accumulator stationary and tensor stationary ways you can do that parallelism. And then the crux of the work that has actually been very challenging for us is we are working with sampling-based randomized algorithms. So the work goes down significantly because of the smart sampling we do with leverage scores. And then it becomes harder to scale that problem. And explain that to the reviewers why, like, hey, we're already 100 times faster than not sampling. So that's why it's scaling a little less. Yes, please. But yeah, there's different ways, because once you go to the tensor work, then your choices go even higher than the matrix work, right? In matrix work, you can do 1D, 2D, 3D. In tensor work, you can keep other things stationary and move other pieces of data around. So the space of slicing that algorithmic problem increases. But I haven't talked anything about distributed memory on the tensor work today. That's it.
Also, can you talk a little bit about how, like, in the you're talking about like SPMM, and you mentioned like 1.5D, but there's of course like arbitrarily many D up to 3 matrix multiplies. Like, how do you choose the dimension modality of matrix multiply?
Yeah, the 1.5D is a kind of an abusing naming that we have to choose. It kind of looks like this. There's several reasons why we call it 1.5D. One of them is because in this case, the matrix is 2D decomposed and the dense ones are actually 1D decomposed. But the real reality is, if you choose this replication factor C, it's not really a replication factor, but the second grid dimension of C by 1, then you get a 1D algorithm. If you choose it by square root of P, you get a 2D-ish algorithm. And why is it not a 2D algorithm? A 2D algorithm does not use extra memory. If you look at the memory consumption in a single processor, in a 2D algorithm, it's exactly 1 over P of the total memory consumption. So it's perfectly memory scalable. Whereas in the 1.5D algorithm, before you do the reduction, each processor will have P extra copies of the output matrix. So it increases the memory temporarily. That's why we kind of use the 0.5 name for that algorithm. And which one I'm going to choose is really sometimes depends on the sparsity. If A is big and B and C are small, and that all depends on what the K, the rank that I'm trying to compute, for example, for some algorithms, or the feature dimension length in the GNN versus the density of A. And then depending on the algorithm, one might win. So you somehow need to go and crunch these numbers and use your best estimate. But you can use all of these algorithms instead of crunching numbers, you can also like run one of them and see which one fits faster.
Cool. Yeah, if there are no other questions, I guess we're at the time. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen, and thanks for
Thank you,
everyone
everyone.
listening.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.